Hey, welcome back to another episode of Ecommerce On Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA. I'm your host, Nathan Resnick, joined by my co-host, Aaron Alpeter. Aaron, for those that are joining for the first time on Ecommerce On Tap, you want to give a quick kind of overview of what we do?
Yeah, first up, thanks so much for tuning in. We put a lot of work into this and love seeing your comments. Each week, we take a well-known or interesting company, usually D2C based. We tell their founding story, reverse engineer their supply chain, and then talk about their exit potential.
I think I'm on a streak of drinking liquid deaths on these, and my favorite episode is our liquid death episode. So if you want one to kind of jump back to, I highly recommend the liquid death one. That was just such a fun story to cover.
Are you a shareholder yet?
Yeah, when they go public, I will be, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But today we're covering Aether Diamonds. It's a really fascinating, direct-to-consumer diamond brand. They don't get their diamonds from a mine. They actually, have a whole manufacturing process themselves, which we'll dive into. And it's pretty cool. But before we do that, was there any kind of interesting tidbits that caught your eye the past week?
Yeah, so Viore hit a $5.5 billion valuation. So Viore was one of the first episodes that we had last season. So they announced an $825 million investment from General Atlantic and Stripes, which that's a large round. 825 million. I just want to pause it for a moment, like take it in. But the interesting thing is that Viore is profitable. They didn't really need the money. They used it a lot as a secondary, but also to have more dry powder to take on Lululemon. And so that's really the thought of why they're raising this money. And then also an interesting point is they continue to build out their store presence really aggressively. And they're on track to have about 100 stores by 2026. And this is up from just a dozen a few years ago.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. Yeah, I love Viore. Their athleisure clothing is some of the best. Super cool to see. And I think like what Lululemon's at like $40 billion market cap or 60 or something in that range. So they've got a ways to go and definitely room to grow, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's also one of these things that once you get to a valuation that high, you're kind of looking at this from the perspective of you're going to compete, right? You're going to go after Lululemon. You're going to hopefully take market share from them, or be as big or bigger than they are. Once you get above a couple $1 billion, it becomes more difficult for a company like Lululemon to say, "Hey, let's acquire them." Although given a 40 to 5 valuation, they could still do that. And there's certainly been acquisitions that are bigger, but they've clearly said we intend to be around. We intend to compete for a long time, and so we wish them all the best.
Yeah, it's awesome. What caught my eye is Forward Health, which I had a close friend that worked there. They kind of abruptly shut down. And for those that don't know Forward Health, it was kind of like a health tech, very forward thinking type of, doctor. They launched like these care pods that they put at different malls. They had raised hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, over $400 million raised. And just like this, I think 2 or 3 days ago, they announced they were shutting down. So kind of crazy to see. I mean, I feel like a lot of these super well capitalized businesses have hit rough kind of turmoil in this market. I mean, we saw just last week, like the vertical farming company Bowery shut down. All these super well capitalized companies are, not sustaining themselves. So I'm not quite sure exactly what happened with Ford. Maybe it was something with their unit economics, or they just couldn't find another investor to kind of keep funding them. But it's crazy because I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars went into Forward Health, and I thought they were super innovative. Had a friend that worked there that was super close to the mission, really just excited about what they were doing, and kind of got that like email earlier this week of, hey, we're laying off everybody and shutting our doors. So kind of crazy to see that happen.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, but also something where it's probably for the best long term. I mean, there's a lot of employees there that had equity that was always going to be worth close to nothing, and so obviously it's traumatic to lose a job and to kind of lose all of that effort that you put into, but you still have that experience. You're moving forward, and just hope everybody's able to find a landing spot quickly.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, today we are going into a diamond brand called Aether Diamonds. I actually was not too familiar with them before I started researching this episode, but it's a pretty fascinating story. I mean, we'll talk about their history, how they started, how they grew, they were acquired, so we'll dive into that too. It's just all around pretty amazing. But I guess I think one thing that stuck out to me is just how their diamonds are made, right? So I'm curious to kind of get the ball rolling here. Like, what are some examples of everyday things that are made of things that you don't expect them to be made of?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I can always think of like going to a playground, and there's some playgrounds that rather than having mulch, they have like chewed up tennis shoes or things like that. So that's one that's new. I've also seen like packaging from mushrooms, which is an interesting one. So it's a thought of like it's more sustainable. Anything come to mind for you?
Yeah, I don't know why this came to mind, but the craziest experience I've had of late, and it's not necessarily something. I mean, it's something that we eat. It's ice cream, but have you ever had one of those Ninja ice cream blenders? We needed an episode on Ninja as a company, but have you had one of their ice cream machines
I haven't.
before?
No.
Oh my gosh, they have this new machine that I think has been out now for like 2 years, but it's called the Creamy. I've had it probably for like 8 months. And I literally have these like Ninja ice creams now, like I don't know, 4 to 5 times a week. And all it is a like protein like shake that you freeze that then their creamy machine turns into ice cream. And it literally tastes like amazing ice cream. It's insane. The ingredients are like, very protein rich and so good for you. And it's like one of those things that you think ice cream has a lot of sugar and it's bad for you and blah blah blah. And like using the creamy, it's actually uh, kind of good for me. So it's shocking. I mean, sometimes I think about that. I'm just like, wow. But yeah, I mean, I remember like what was it, the Olympics in was it Paris where they made furniture from like cardboard? Was that another thing that they did?
Yeah, yeah, that's one. I've
So
seen like protein powders made from crickets.
yeah,
That's an
yeah,
interesting one. I mean, there's some science behind that one, but yeah, there's lots of examples you can think of just things that don't quite fit when you think about it.
hmm,
And the interesting thing with Aether is they make their diamonds from extracting CO2 from the air. And so you don't think about you think diamonds come from mines, um, but yeah, there's also these lab grown diamonds that have a different suppository process. These ones they actually take air from the outside, purify it, and then they're able to make diamonds from it. And so we'll get into that process a little bit more. But that was an interesting kind of thought of I would never have expected that you can make diamonds out of thin air.
yeah, that's wild. I mean, and you would think whoever did that would be filthy rich, but we'll see how Aether does. But I guess before we dive into their founding story, do you want to touch on kind of the history of lab grown diamonds?
Yeah, we touched on a lot of this during the Brilliant Earth episode that we did a couple months ago. And so, just for those who maybe haven't listened to that one, we'll kind of go through the history of lab grown diamonds. So, the first synthetic diamonds were made in 1954 using a pressure called HPHT. And the process is called high pressure, high temperature. And initially, these diamonds were made for industrial uses. So think drill bits, those sorts of things. And just diamonds are an excellent cutting tool because they are literally, I think, the hardest, if not the hardest material out there. And eventually, they moved from industrial uses over to more consumer uses. And in the 70s and 80s, you started to see the increase in technology where these gem quality diamonds were still rare and expensive, but were getting better and better. And there was a new process called chemical vapor deposition that was invented in the 80s that allowed you to grow diamonds at lower pressures and temperatures. So rather than trying to mimic the heat and pressure of the Earth's crust, you could do it at an easier way of doing it. Basically, what it does is you have some gas that reacts with the substrate and leaves behind the carbon that makes the diamonds. And so this is the leading methodology today for lab grown diamonds. Most people use this process today. But by the early 2000s, there was a lot of technological advancements. There was a lot of um, history or just bad things coming out about the diamond industry in general. And so there was a greater awareness toward where these diamonds were coming from, making sure that they were ethically uh, sourced or grown. And so this is where these conflict-free lab-grown diamonds became more and more popular. And so since the 2010s and now in the 2020s, there have been quite a few luxury brands that have started to incorporate lab-grown diamonds into these collections. In 2018, the FTC actually updated their guidelines to say that lab-grown diamonds were real diamonds before they were kind of, uh, seen as separate. And so now that they're seen as equal in the eyes of the FTC, there's a lot more legitimate use of these diamonds and acceptance of diamonds in the general industry. And so that's kind of where they are today. And I think getting into specifically with Aether a little bit, they were successful in producing these CO2 originated diamonds in the early 2020s. And they've been able to kind of leverage this carbon capture technology with the traditional diamond synthesis method, like CVD, in order to create it. And so I think one of the interesting things that I want to dive into in this episode is really just this carbon capture meets jewelry or meets diamonds sort of thing that goes through.
Yeah, I mean, you would think with their carbon capture method that like diamonds would be in abundance now, which is interesting because like I think on one hand, I think of this from like a B Corp standpoint where it's like okay, they're trying to do better for the planet, which is awesome. I love that mission. But then on the other hand, you know, I don't know if like I were to gift or I don't know if I were to give my girlfriend, a diamond that came from air. I don't quite know how she would react, to be honest. She'd probably be like, what is this? And I don't know.
Hopefully she focuses on the fact that you're giving her a diamond,
Yeah,
and you might want to like qualify that a little bit and be like, hey, this is a gift versus this
right.
means something else. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that's true. But I don't know. I think it's interesting because like when most people, I think at least in America, think of diamonds, they think of like, a proposal or getting engaged. And I don't quite know if like lab grown diamonds have become mainstream yet. I think there's this kind of common debate. And I would be curious, I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but like what percent of lab grown diamonds have now been, part of this kind of engagement process? Because I mean, I would assume there would be a spike after that 2018 FTC ruling, but I'm not quite sure. I mean, what are your thoughts around that?
well, I think it's consumer perception. So I think that yeah, there are people that find value in a diamond and the fact that they spent $20,000. They can tell people they spent $20,000 on it. But there's a lot of people who are just like, hey, this is shiny and I like it, and it didn't cost me $20,000. Like, let's do that. I know that like, personally, we've moved over to just purchasing other shiny things. Like moissanite is a great not diamond gem thing that's going through. I can't remember if I think it's lab grown as well. But those are sorts of things I think are very interesting, and like it's growing. Whether it's growing at 1% a year or 50% a year is up for debate, but it's an interesting change I think is coming.
Yeah, for sure. And so the founding history of Aether Diamonds is pretty unique. I mean, there's four co-founders, so Anthony Polito, Daniel Wajno, Robert Hagman, and Ryan Shearman. So it was founded in 2018. Ryan's, was the CEO. He has a mechanical engineering background, and Anthony is a chemical engineer. So they actually met through Ryan's brother, David, engineering and management background with jewelry operational experience, like at Pandora before this, and Robert, who was the CMO, had a marketing background at like a spirits company before joining Aether. So they actually together patented this process for generating synthetic diamonds via the carbon capture process that you had described, Aaron. And I think that's kind of like a bit of the genesis for this company is it kind of stemmed more so from like a technological like carbon capture, like how do we make CO2 into diamonds versus like hey we want to start this diamond brand, right? And so it's interesting, I mean, like how these four ended up starting a diamond company.
Yeah, it is interesting because I think where we said last week that Bombas was mission first and then a business, I feel like Aether was technology first and then a business because they did something that was really, really interesting. I think from their perspective of how they got started, they were informed first and foremost by the impact of the mining industry on the environment. So in the 2010s, there was a lot of conversation around the social impact. You hear about blood diamonds, the ethical treatment of the workers, and that's very, very important. But they looked at it and said, hey, there's some stuff going on environmentally as well. And so just some statistics that were shared is for every carat of diamond that's extracted, approximately 100 square feet of land are disturbed. So a 1 carat diamond, 100 square feet, that's pretty big. It's like the size of a large room. and over 2.6 tons of mineral waste are generated. So there's a lot of stuff going into a 1 to 10 carat diamond, things like that. And then from a water perspective, on average, a single carat of diamond consumes about 0.5 to 0.73 cubic meters of water. And this water is obviously it's being consumed, but then also the runoff and the waste. And these mining operations can lead to a large amount of water pollution if it's not treated, because this water has chemicals in it as well to help the cleaning process and the mining process. In 2016, the Diamond Producers Association reported that their members emitted an average of 160 kilograms of CO2 for every polished carat that was produced. And so a pretty sizable carbon impact as well. And then, just start adding on air pollution, soil erosion, energy consumption. And this was a big deal. And so Ryan had worked in the jewelry business before, as you mentioned, and he was pretty aware of the impact that that diamonds in particular, but mining in general, were having on the environment. And so he had started a couple tech companies in the past. He knew that there should be some technical way to either mitigate or eliminate these impacts it was having. And so he found some founders that had a strong experience with air pollution. So one of the companies that they worked at was David Yurman. And when they were in Bangkok, Bangkok is kind of known for having pretty bad air pollution. And so when they went to go visit a factory there, they were kind of saying like, hey, this isn't great. Our products, are never shown in a dirty environment. They're always clean and premium. And yet the environment that's being produced isn't great. And so the thought was, what if we could pull CO2 from the atmosphere and turn it into diamonds? That was the initial idea.
It's such a crazy thought. I mean, like imagine that, right? Pulling CO2 from the atmosphere and making diamonds. I mean, if someone were to tell me that, I'd just be like, what? Like that sounds crazy. But here we are talking about Aether Diamonds that literally does that. It's crazy. And so, the first few years were really focused on the science and the research process in terms of how you do this. And that's what turned into their patent on this method that they invented. And I mean, it's just crazy, the technological breakthroughs that they had to go through, both from a mechanical and chemical standpoint, to be able to do this is pretty mind blowing. I mean, I don't know. I just saw the high levels of their patent, and it's above my engineering capabilities by far. But it's just pretty wild to see how they were able to do this. So, Ryan originally just pulled from his previous kind of textbooks from his college classes to try to investigate and understand what process would make sense. He then pitched this idea to his brothers, who thought it was actually viable. I mean, I feel like if my brother had pitched this to me, I would have been like, I don't know. But anyway, so Anthony then brought this project to Ryan's brother, who would bring that chemical engineering knowledge that they need. And at first, the company was called Impossible Diamonds because it seemed rather impossible to actually do this, to turn CO2 into a diamond. Just seems impossible. But then they thought the name Aether Diamonds better reflects the company's unique process of producing diamonds from the carbon dioxide in the air. And the company didn't deliver its first products until 2021. So they basically spent like 3 years kind of in R&D, going through the patent process. And the company is actually a B Corp, that really, I think, hits home on their mission of, trying to do better for the planet. And, as they say, we became a B Corp to make sure that we were benefiting our primary stakeholder, planet Earth, which I think is, pretty amazing. They really try to hit home on this mission. And as of 2022, the company was the only one in this space to have this, certification. And I think it's interesting. I mean, we've had and talked about other B Corps on Ecommerce On Tap. And I always go back and forth on this in terms of when does something this make sense, right? Because at the end of the day, a company, needs to produce profits and value for its shareholders, right? And so, though I think there's a lot of other initiatives like we've talked about, like 1% for the planet, that really aligns with that kind of do good and make money type of mission. B Corp, I think, even takes that a step further. So I don't know. I'm curious, Aaron. Like, what are your takes on B Corps in general?
Yeah, it's nuanced. We actually looked at being a B Corp ourselves a few years ago and learned a lot about the process. And I'd say that in general, I'm very supportive of the ideas behind, what they're trying to do. where you're trying to treat people, make sure that your company is a net positive for the world in the terms of social or environmental or um, other cultural things that you can participate. But the cynic in me says, B Corp is a company itself, right? They make money on the certifications and on the testings, and so there's like, is that something that's really there? I think that the challenge of a B Corp is that while you are able to canonize some beliefs with your company, and you're kind of writing them down for that certification, if you were to no longer adhere to those beliefs or keep up with the compliance piece, you just lose your B Corp certification. It's not as if there's a penalty there. And so it almost on some level feels like a little bit of greenwashing, where they say, hey, we paid for the certification, it's good. Now, granted, do I think a B Corp is more responsible than a C Corp? Absolutely. Like someone who's gone through that and done that virtual signing is important. But I think, like you said, there is a responsibility to generate profit for shareholders and to do those sorts of things. And so does a B Corp limit its acquisition targets? Maybe, right? Like, is it something where potentially a company is going to say, we're going to buy it and then remove it? But I don't know. It's definitely a nuanced thing. I'm glad that it exists, but I also think that there are other ways to canonize the values of a company beyond just having the certification.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, what you said in terms of B Corp is a kind of company itself that makes money hits home for me a little bit, So I think it's interesting. I mean, I think it can help further align a corporation, but at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of other things that you could do as a C Corp or LLC that could align yourself even more, really.
Yeah, it's exactly like the Better Business Bureau. Like, if you've ever seen somebody that has an A+ rating with a Better Business Bureau, that's because they paid money.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Only way to get it.
yeah, we could tell a lot of stories about that or Yelp and some of their aggressive practices with different restaurants and shops. But anyway, what stood out to me as I looked at Aether Diamonds and their kind of product collections is they have the standard, or not standard, but the engagement rings that you would think that they sell. They have wedding bands. They have just all sorts of types of jewelry, including necklaces, bracelets, earrings, and not just for women. They actually have men too. I almost bought myself a nice bracelet. But what's interesting is in those products that do not include diamonds, they do mention using like recycled gold or recycled materials that aren't diamonds, and they really try to align like everything about their branding and website is in regards to sustainability. And what they say is that each diamond carat produced by Aether contributes to a net reduction of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And I didn't buy a diamond, but it would be kind of cool if you think about it from like an unboxing standpoint. If you got a diamond and like in it, it says, hey, this diamond helped reduce X amount of CO2 emission or something like that to really like directly correlate, the numbers behind this diamond and how it's benefited the environment. But, it's interesting because in some sense, it sounds too good to be true. And if you look into their process, I mean, it is fairly technical.
Yeah, I think if I did that and I gave my wife a diamond from Aether, she'd be like, "Oh, why didn't you get a bigger one then?" You know. So we'll see. But you're right. Their process is really interesting. So, like we talked about, their diamonds are produced by capturing carbon directly from the atmosphere or an industrial uh, process. And so they do this from a very high level. What they do is they have air that's passed through a box that has a filter in it. And the filter releases the CO2 into the box, which is later collected. Then after that CO2 is purified, they convert it into what they call a precursor. And then finally, the precursors turn into a diamond using that CVD process we talked about. And the interesting thing here is that there is a lot of energy that's involved to make these diamonds, and so there are fossil fuels that power most companies that are out there, and so there is some carbon impact that's there. But I think their thought is that they are moving toward renewable sources of energy, or they're just taking in so much CO2 that it's offsetting that way. But the interesting part of this is that the benefit of their new type of product is that they can actually sequester CO2 from the air. So it's less about hooking this up to a smokestack and saying, hey, we were going to make this CO2 anyways, and so let's just make less. But in theory, you could, I don't know, get this machine, pop it out your window, and eventually be able to purify it to some extent. And you think about it, if you take carbon from the atmosphere and put it into a diamond, it's never going to return back to the atmosphere um, as CO2. So it actually is taking it and putting it into a different way. I mean, you think about other ways that we've looked at carbon capture in the past, and people say, "Oh, we'll plant more trees." That is something where, yes, it'll turn that, but eventually it could turn back into CO2 for the atmosphere. There's scrubbers, which allow you to capture things and maybe bury it underground, but all those things could come back. But putting it in a diamond, just given the properties of the diamond and the decay of a diamond, literally means that the CO2 would not be returned. And so it's a really interesting piece that's there. And I think that one of the things that they had pointed out that really was remarkable to me is that they can go from carbon in the air to delivering a diamond to a customer in 12 weeks, which was just remarkable. You couldn't grow most things in 12 weeks to do that. I mean, unless you have some weird chicken thing that you're accelerating its growth by. But that's just remarkable that within 3 months you can have something that you were breathing on your hand.
Yeah, that's wild. That is wild. I mean, yeah, that whole process is pretty mind blowing, and just the fact that they invented that process to make diamonds is pretty eye opening. I mean, just goes to show there's a lot of innovation to be had, and who knows what the next decade of diamonds and just consumers in this industry has. What was interesting to me is their financial milestones, right? So they started the company in 2018. They didn't really raise a seed round until 2020. So they raised 2.7 million, led by Catch Ventures, and they were employing about 6 people in 2020. And then 2022, so they must have grown, a bit. They raised the Series A for 18.3 million, led by Helena and TRIREC, Trirec. And the funds were really developed or raised to develop a wholesale business. So I assume, they started with a D2C approach, then they raised money to expand into wholesale. And, I think too, I mean, as you dove into their supply chain, what stuck out to you on that side, Aaron?
Yeah, so clearly their manufacturing process is the cool secret sauce here, and this is quite honestly why we're profiling them. When you look at their supply chain, it gets very long very quickly. So as of 2022, the diamonds were created with their technology here in the U.S. Then they were sent to India, where they were polished and finished, and then they would come back to the U.S. to be sold. And so, they may have been carbon neutral in the creation, but certainly weren't carbon neutral in the distribution side. To get even longer, the carbon dioxide that they captured actually came from Switzerland. So I don't know what was wrong with the air in North America, but the idea was that they had someone who could give them pure carbon that they were pulling from the atmosphere. And so you go from Switzerland to the U.S. to India, back to the U.S., and then to the customer in some way. And so that's a difficult piece just to manage and take care of. Another issue is that they used fossil fuels in the generation of their diamonds, which isn't in of itself a bad thing. But when you're trying to go along and say, "Hey, we're carbon negative," that's a difficult thing to kind of substantiate from a claim perspective. And so they have seen this as something they need to resolve, and so they've been working to try to improve it with their supply chain. And as of 2021, I think what I saw is they had invested in solar and wind and getting access to that energy, and so they were able to get closer to a net negative impact. I think the other piece that's interesting is that they try to operate as lean of inventory as possible, in the sense of being more made to order versus make to stock. And so the intention really wasn't to make as many diamonds as possible, but to wait for someone to come in and order. And I think the challenge with that is that most buyers probably don't know the type of diamond they want. They know the type of ring that they want, but they just assume that the diamond is going to be of a certain quality or clarity and cut, and they go with that. And so a little bit of a backwards piece there, where if someone's like, "Hey, great, we can get this to you in 12 weeks," versus someone's like, "Hey, this is ready now." Sometimes you're trying to pop the question, or you missed an anniversary or birthday. You kind of got to get something right now. So that's a challenge into their model.
Yeah, and so they've always tried to look at vertically integrating their process, right? I mean, mainly because having all these different steps hurts their carbon footprint. I thought it was super. Just I was kind of surprised, honestly, to see that they're getting the carbon from Switzerland and then making it in America and then polishing it in India. It's like, to me, that in some sense defeats the purpose of being net negative from a carbon standpoint, because you think about the energy that's needed to ship diamonds to India and back and all that stuff. It just seems like a lot going on in their supply chain for this net negative carbon mission that they have. But they've tried to vertically integrate, but they found it super hard to achieve. So as of 2021, they had three different facilities doing three different parts of the process that you mentioned, and they've looked at doing it all under the same roof. I couldn't tell if this had been completed or not. Um, but I think it's just kind of crazy that they've got to piece together these different parts of their supply chain to produce their finished product like they do. And I think too, like in general, this trend is growing of customer perception of lab grown diamonds, that is more accepted compared to from mines. And so they were looking to kind of scale out this process in alignment with consumer perception by offering their products in wholesalers in the future. But I think it's super fascinating. I mean, knowing this, knowing their history, knowing their financing, I mean, what does the future look like? I mean, they had some pretty exciting news in September, right?
Yeah, yeah. So this is where the story kind of diverges a little bit because in September of 2024, Aether was purchased by Brilliance, another very large company in the space. The amount of the transaction wasn't disclosed, but I would imagine it's probably in the tens of millions of dollars, not the hundreds of millions. But the interesting piece is that Rome Brilliance has a natural footprint in India, and so they are well suited to kind of take some of the stuff in house, and it's one of those parts that is very interesting from that perspective. And so I think that where the story starts to get interesting is that Aether Diamonds, which was the D2C element, it was the consumer facing piece that's been sold, but the founders actually carved out and took the technology and rolled that into another company.
Yeah, I mean, so that other company, basically they went on to found Loa Carbon, and it basically uses that similar patent to synthesize sustainable hydrocarbons in the air to produce other products. I mean, we'll see what they do, but Ryan has shared multiple ideas to use this technology for other uses than diamonds, and we'll see. I mean, I think diamonds sounds like it was like the first thing that came to mind in terms of what they could produce with this process, and now they're probably exploring a lot more in terms of what they could do here with this.
Yeah, and I think it's the right move because you think about they've invented something very interesting. I mean, the promise of being able to remove carbon from the atmosphere and put it into something that people would want, and we're not just kind of like burying it in an old salt mine or trying to just deal with it, but actually something that people could use. It is a game breaking technology, and I think that as they went through it, they recognized that hey, our margin structure probably isn't the greatest with this really long supply chain that we have. And perhaps maybe the interesting piece of what we have is not the D2C business or the brand or those customers, but it's the technology. And so I think that they made the right move where you think about the market for carbon capture potentially is probably much bigger than a D2C diamond company. And so I think sometimes you have to shed some assets and look, these guys got to exit, so they can say that they learned a lot there. They found a good home for their customers. They still have a client using their process, I would assume. And so it's just a really smart thing that they did to kind of say, all right, we're going to say no to this opportunity. We're going to intentionally not focus on it. And then we're all going to move. Because I think that's the interesting part is that all four founders moved into low carbon. And so, yeah, very interesting piece that way from my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think they'll continue to use this technology to produce other products, and we'll see what they roll out next. Sounds like Loa Carbon is kind of like their holding co, and they'll roll out different products from that. But it's a super fascinating episode. I think it's rare that we see an e-commerce brand or DTC brand kind of start from a technological innovation like this. And it's just kind of shocking to me that even we can, like, I didn't know we could produce diamonds from CO2 before this. So that's pretty neat. And yeah, I really appreciate everyone tuning in to this episode of E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Source Finance. But leave a review, share with a friend, let Aaron and I know what you think of this episode, and let us know if there's other brands you want us to cover. We're always interested in high growth brands that we should do a deep dive on. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time on E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA.